At Let's Tell Their Story, we'd like to advise that some content may contain rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, child abduction, and murder. Not all content is suitable for all audiences. Please be advised while listening. Thank you. Hey guys, sorry about the little missing act that I have done over the last month. I had some changes at work and my mental and physical abilities were just completely worn out to even be doing any episodes. So I'm back. My body has adjusted to the new position. My mental health is pretty good on the end of that. So going into season 2 of Let's Tell Their Story, I'm sure many of you have heard me talking about some new changes that are be coming to you beauties this year. So I'm going to give you kind of a rundown on what some of those changes are going to be. First, as many of you have noticed, the mid-month missing has no longer been being done. The views I was hoping for just weren't there, but I do feel that these are people that need to be recognized. So at the beginning of each episode, there will be one missing person detailed, and the recognized person will be from the state the episode takes place in. Then the episode, and then the second change, I guess there's only a couple like I said, only a couple changes, just 2 changes. The second change, and it's probably the biggest one, and the one that I'm probably the most excited about and the most nervous about, sometime in June, the YouTube page podcast will have video content along with it. So look out for that come June. I will give you probably a week's notice that the video content will be up. So let's get into this. I am going to be doing the missing person content starting today and from here on out forward. So let's get into the episode. Today, the missing person for this episode is Donna Ann Watts. She is an African-American female from Houston, Texas that was had last contact with anyone on January 22nd, 2015. Dora is currently 66 years of age, weighs 230 pounds, and is right around 5 feet tall. Dora traveled to New York City by Greyhound and was picked up by a cab at 547 9th Avenue and dropped off at 126 Williams Avenue and has not been seen or heard from since. Dora has black hair and brown eyes. If you have any information about Dora Ann Watts, please contact a Lieutenant Squire of the Humble Police Department at 281-446-7127. Now let's get into this week's episode, or this week's case. Fred and Edwina Rogers were the quiet neighbors that kept to themselves. Whether you're a social butterfly or an extreme introvert, that could either drive you crazy or the best neighbors to ever have. Now, I have neighbors on both spectrums of this, as I consider myself more of an ambivert. This works great for me. So an ambivert is basically someone who can adjust to being an introvert or an extrovert. Now, as reclusive as Fred and Edwina were, their son Charles was even more reclusive. He lived in the home with his parents. He would leave early in the morning hours and wouldn't return until late in the evenings. And the most communication he would have with his parents was through notes that were pushed back and forth under his bedroom door that was in the attic area of the house. Even though Charles actually owned the house, for 5 years, those notes were passed back and forth, and Edwina had said that she hadn't even seen her son in 5 years. Many people spend their days out of the house due to work. It's alleged this was not the case for Charles, as nobody's really sure if Charles actually had a job. And if he didn't, nobody really knows what Charles was spending his days doing. Now, Charles wasn't just your average middle-aged man living off his parents. Obviously, he owned the house. He was an extremely intelligent man. At one time, he had attended Texas A&M University, but dropped out to attend University of Houston, where he earned a degree in nuclear physics. During World War II, he was a pilot with the U.S. Navy, where he served with the Office of Naval Intelligence. To the outside world, it seemed as though Charles Rogers had it all, a life of success and affluence, as he worked for Shell Oil as a seismologist, finding gas, oil, and gold. But in 1957, he up and quit, and no one knows why. And that is when Charles Rogers moved back home with his parents. On June 23rd, 1965, the lives of Houston police officers C.M. Bullock and his partner L.M. Barta and Edwina's nephew Marvin would forever be changed. Marvin tried telephoning Edwina for a couple days, and his calls kept going unanswered. He began to get worried, so he went over to 1815 Driscoll in Montrose, an area outside of Houston. He found the house was locked and the blinds were down. He became even more concerned than he already was and called to have a welfare check done on the couple. This was assigned to Bullock and Barta. They finally showed up around 9 p.m. They knocked on the front door and got no response. So they went around to the back, and they noticed that the back door was wedged shut from the inside with heavy flower pots. They pushed their way through. Once inside, the home was somewhat in disarray, but Marvin assured the officers that this was normal since the couple was elderly and probably didn't keep the house as pristine as they once had. That comment right there, I'm going to let you know further in this case, you're going to question that comment right there. So as the cops ventured through the house, nothing seemed to be missing. Though the house it had a very eerie feeling to it, as there was uneaten food on the table, as though the couple had just vanished. Just as the officers had finished up their welfare check, Bullock, unsure why, but he decided to check the refrigerator. Nothing seemed out of place, and everything was within its dates. However, there was an extensive amount of meat that filled every shelf, and even for Texas, this was odd. Bullock, though finding it unusual, he assumed that someone in the house had a hog that was slaughtered. Now, you know what they say about assuming. Well, it wasn't until Bullock was about to close the door that something unusual caught his eye in the vegetable bin crisper, depending on where you're at, what you call it, were the severed heads of Fred and Edwina Rogers. I don't know how many times, I am so sorry that a lot of these cases involve severed heads. I am sorry. I don't know why. I don't go looking for them. I apologize. It just happens. The extensive meat that was on every shelf was the torsos and the legs of the couple, yet their arms would never be found. Now, could that have been because the killer didn't want the bodies to be identified through fingerprints? Or was something more going on? Now, it's going to get real graphic as I tell you about how the couple had been murdered before their dismembered mutilation. So, just a heads up on that one. Fred had been beaten to death with a claw hammer and his eyes had been gouged out. and his genitals were flushed, or his genitals were cut off, and his intestines were flushed down the toilet. Edwina, she was punched and shot in the head. They were able to figure out that the dismemberment had actually took place in the bathroom of the home, and even though the arms would never be found, there was no evidence that any cannibalism took place. While the lower level of the house was somewhat in disarray, most of the rest of the house had been thoroughly cleaned, yet something got missed. There was a small trail of blood that led to the attic bedroom from the bathroom. Inside that attic bedroom lived 43-year-old Charles Rogers. In the attic, the officers found clothing, a hot plate that Charles had cooked on, a kettle, dishes, ham radios, and a blood-stained saw. Charles was not in that room and would never be seen or heard from again. It was evident that Charles had murdered his parents, but why did he do it? And where was Charles? Now, there are multiple theories as to what happened with Charles, and we're going to go into a few of these with more details and then a few more with less details. The first one, and probably the most logical, at least in my mind it's the most logical one, is that Charles suffered with a mental illness, and when he up and quit his job with the oil company, it's possible that that could have been what happened, was he just snapped and couldn't do it anymore. But it's alleged that he had snapped on Fred and Edwina because it's alleged that Fred abused him when he was a child, and Edwina really didn't do anything to make the facts what's the word I'm looking for? Edwina really didn't help the cause. She didn't step in or anything. And it's possible that Charles just one day snapped and he killed Fred and Edwina because of that. Okay. Then there is the allegations that Charles was involved with the JFK assassination. This goes back to the book The Man on the Grassy Knoll by John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers. They believed that Charles could have very possibly been one of the so-called tramps that was spotted in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. And that Charles very well could have recorded his involvement with JFK's death in his diaries, and that either Edwina and Fred had come across these diaries, and they were going to call the authorities or basically call Charles out on it, and Charles felt that he needed to kill them so his secret didn't get out. And then they believed that after he had killed his parents, that he had moved to Mexico and landed a mining job through his oil industry connections. Now, with his disappearing act, there's also the allegations, we're going to move into the next one, that he was a CIA agent, which goes back to the ham radios in his attic bedroom. And that was how he was able to just disappear without a trace. And he basically vanished like a ghost, and he completed his missions. Then there is by another book is the Icebox Murders, which this case is more well known by that. Hugh and Martha Gardenier, they believed not only that Charles had killed Fred and Edwina because of the abuse as a child, but they actually didn't really stop abusing Charles as a child. They actually abused him even when he wasn't there, when he was out doing his oil stuff. Fred would go in and take loans out in Charles's name, and Fred and Edwina pretty much robbed Charles of all of his savings. And this eventually made Charles's life a living hell. Then there is getting back to the Gardeniers, they actually believed that not only did Charles disappear to Mexico, but he eventually ended up in Honduras. And that would be where they believe he either did one of two things. He either got a job as a seismologist there and lived out his life quietly, or he was killed by Hondurans that found out about his CIA connections. In 1975, Charles Rogers was declared dead. There was also the possibility that he ended up in Guatemala and lived out his days again quietly. Or there's also the possibility that Charles had committed suicide after he had killed his parents. However, his body was never found, or any kind of remains, anything that actually suggested that he had committed suicide, unless he happened to be in Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, or wherever he may have disappeared to. Regardless of what happened to Charles Rogers, he makes D.B. Cooper and H.H. Holmes look like amateurs with their disappearing acts. He did a disappearing act nobody's really ever seen. And that concludes the story of the Icebox Murders, or the story of Charles Rogers, depending on which way you want to look at this. Until next time, stay safe, but stay curious.